Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the wind. The wind blows because air is piled up and is moving away from wherever there is a concentration of air molecules to wherever there is a low concentration. So the wind blows because the earth is heated differently. Some parts of the earth are hotter than others. For that reason, as hot air rises, it leaves voids, and then piles of air will blow from there to other places. Well, this wind has energy. So the difference between how hot something is and how cold something is, the difference in how close they are together, means you can have some very strong winds. Most of the time, the wind that blows that you have, almost 100% of your life, you have just gentle breeze, just a barely, you can't really even tell that the wind is blowing. But when storms arise or when you have very big pressure differences between high and low, you can have serious winds, and those winds can carry particles. So it almost acts like a huge river where the energy of the wind is picking up some particles and bumping around other particles and dragging other particles or rolling other particles. And it can do two different things. It can carve, so it can actually erode, say, a bank or a mountain, and it can transport the parts that it has scraped off away from wherever the source is. So let's look at some of the details. So wind can transport particles just like water. A lot of times water can move heavier particles than wind because the wind just doesn't blow with a lot of force. In rare cases, when you have tornadoes or hurricanes, you can have enough force to carry very large objects, just the way a raging river would move boulders or huge rocks. You could have that in the case of a violent wind event. So remember, when we're really talking about two different things. We're talking about erosion, which is essentially wearing away something. So the wind blowing against a mountain, and after years, you're actually going to shape that mountain. The wind will shape it by grinding off certain particles. So that'll be true. And then transport. So it's carrying it away. So at the end of it, that particle that used to be part of a mountain, for instance, is now not only broken off the mountain, but carried far away from the mountain somewhere else. So wind can do not as great a job as water in terms of erosion, but wind is a strong number two. So let's look at the ways that this actually applies to rivers as well. So the same thing would happen on the bottom of a stream. So some of the material is actually going to be suspended in the air. So imagine dust. That dust is in the air, and the air is holding on to it and moving it with its energy. So if it has enough energy, if it's small enough, the wind's energy can carry some suspended particles. The heavier the wind, the larger those suspended particles can be. Okay. The next one would be saltation. Saltar in Spanish means to jump. So saltation is this idea of hopping because it doesn't have enough power to suspend a particle because it's too big, but it can make it hop. So it can kind of like lift it off the ground, and then it bops off the ground, and then it's lifted again off the ground. So it's a particle small enough that the wind can partially suspend it, maybe. Okay, or every once in a while intermittently suspended. Then you have creep, and creep is basically rolling along the bottom. So if you were to have rocks being rolled by the wind, this happens a lot of times in deserts. There's a cool desert somewhere that everyone I've seen pictures of where the particles are driven by the wind, and you end up with these large rocks that have rounded themselves almost like bowling balls. And if you come across this very, very flat place, you wonder why all the rocks are perfectly round. Well, it's because they've been driven by the wind place to place to place, and as they've gone, they've ground off the edges, almost the way a rock in a river does. But because the wind can blow in lots of different directions, you can go east and west and north and south, rather than a stream usually going in a forward direction, instead of having a lopsided river rock that just has rounded corners, you would actually have a large boulder that's perfectly round. And some people think it's aliens, but I really believe it's the wind. The next one is deflation. Deflation is the idea that if fine dust is carried away by the wind, but the bigger rocks the wind doesn't have enough strength to carry it away. So let's look at this picture over to the right. If the wind can drive the particles of the dust, the sand or the soil, and drive it into the wind and be transported away, but not be able to carry the larger stones, then over time, all of the brown material is carried away, but the pebbles still stay there. And so it's a lowering of the land surface, and it becomes rockier. So you end up with more of a lunar type of landscape because all the fine particles have been blown away, and what's left is called a desert pavement, which is more rocky and less sandy, less soily. Okay. The next one is abrasion. What a cool picture. Abrasion is when sand that's blown by the wind, or any types of sediment that's blown by the wind, can actually grind on other rocks. So as one is being brought into another, you can grind things away. I know a lot of sailors or fishermen, if you set your lobster pots or whatever crab pots in the bay, and the constant tide is making it go up and down and up and down, it can actually grind it on, say, a stone or something on the bottom of the bay, and you end up wearing out your pots because it's essentially abrasion. And the same thing can happen when small particles are ground into other larger rocks by the wind. In this case, you've got sand. The wind is strong enough to take that sand and actually use it like sandpaper against the bottom of this rock. One day that column is going to give out, and I'd hate to be the turtle underneath that boulder. Ventifacts are rocks that have been shaped by wind blown. So venti comes from the word wind. So you know what an artifact is, something that's left over after something has happened. A ventifact is something that's left over after the wind has blown. So it's a rock that's shaped. So you can have beautiful ones out west where you can have, arches and columns and where the wind is coming in the same direction all the time and making it very, very smooth. So it almost looks like it's been carved. Deposition just means deposits. So if you catch up a bunch of sand in the air and then the air stops moving, so the wind stops blowing, and then it's dropped, it's going to fall wherever it falls. So if you have a very sandy place like the Sahara Desert, I believe that's where this is, it's in Africa, North Africa, you're going to get dunes. So it's accumulated piles of very small particles, normally sand. You can have dunes of other stuff, gypsum. There's a place in New Mexico that I went out. We had some friends there, and it's called White Sands because it's gypsum. It's the same stuff that's in wallboard. I'm sure I breathed it in and gave myself cancer, but we were going down it on skateboards with no wheels, so it was almost like we were surfing on this. It was so fun. But you can do the same thing with dunes. There's nothing under it. There's nothing to support it. It's just a pile of very loose particles, so those loose particles can slip and slide, and you can have all kinds of fun doing that. You end up having definite shapes. You can see, first of all, the ripples as light wind is blowing along the surface of it and rising them, basically wrinkling it. And then you have a leeward side and a windward side. So the windward side is always gentle. So it's the one that has not a steep side, but a very shallow side. That's the windward. The wind is carrying lots of material and making it nice and long. Then when the dune is in its own way in terms of the wind, and so the windward side is very steep. So it's steep on the leeward side. It's very shallow on the windward side. Now, a dune can migrate. So for instance, if you have a sand dune that has a long windward side and a very short, steep leeward side, over time, all of that wind that's on the windward side is going to go over the edge and fall off on the other side, and eventually the entire dune migrates. Okay, that's called dune migration. Loess is really, it's like silt. I don't know, do you know what, it's almost like clay particles, but it's dry. So it's very fine sand, dust, if you want to think of it. So you can have so much silt in the air, just a normal breeze can carry so much of this that it can carry over a long distance. And if for whatever reason the wind is blocked by something, let's say a mountain, so that it's always blocked in the same time, you can have piles of this silt, and these are called loess hills. Loess, okay, Loess.